cloud native. We're going to have a chat with someone who's definitely influenced my thinking and probably a whole generation of people's thinking about computing. And I'm joined today by a very special guest, Adrian Cockcroft, one of the most thoughtful and certainly has some of the best perspective on what's going on. So we should have some fun today.
Hi there.
Hi,
Thanks.
Adrian.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and we're looking forward to seeing you in Vegas next week, talking about just all the trends you see, kind of the obviously you popularized some of the stuff you did at Netflix, the conversations around continuous delivery, microservices, all these things. A lot of people, there's no shortage of reference to Adrian Cockcroft in plenty of other people's talks. I know I'm probably one of the most guilty referencing Adrian's. I've straight ripped off all your bullet points from a number of talks to kind of make a point. So with all that going on, how do you see this landscape, or what are the things that you're seeing interested in? There's kind of a few things going on. Obviously, there's the work that you're doing at Battery and the vantage point you have working with the kind of portfolio of startups. And then there's lots of other work going on around industries. What's your kind of most inspired advice for people, or how would you, if you're looking at what's going on right now, think about the problems that are facing all these organizations as they try to adopt the new technologies?
It's a big topic. Actually, for quite a while, the opening slide I had was baffling late adopters as a service, and it was a screenshot of a tweet, and it said retweeted by Andrew Clay Schaefer, because you were retweeting all the thing as a service, and I think I was riffing off something you were doing for a while. But yeah, to some extent, I've been going around baffling late adopters for the last few years. It's kind of what it felt like. But it's starting to get there. So the late adopters are, largely big enterprises, and they finally started moving, and they're figuring out how to retool all their technologies. And I think that's why the whole Spring Boot, Spring Cloud stuff's particularly interesting, because they're heavily into Java. They're not really going to move from Java, and they're looking for what's the most effective way to update their Java environments. So that's generally what I'm seeing in that space.
So the way that I've been articulating and framing this sort of notion of cloud native is without being and somewhat purposely vague, actually, that there's this new dominant paradigm that's emerging for how people are going to do IT going forward. Mm-hmm. The things that are happening, and we didn't have this. We had a few other interesting conversations, but we didn't have this one. But I think you'll agree, and maybe that's a good place to start, that all these things that people are sort of talking about in isolation are actually a single phenomena. So when people are talking about continuous delivery, microservices, DevOps, cloud computing, that those are aspects of the same phenomena, which is this new dominant IT paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, I quite often draw an OODA loop with the sort of innovation. How do you get out of the way of innovation, which is a cultural thing, and then you can tie all the big data analytics into it, and then the decision making for what you actually get done is again more cultural piece, and then cloud, and that's really the continuous delivery, continuous integration delivery loop. The faster you get around that loop, the more competitive you are. And what we're seeing is kind of it's moving from being theoretically, it would be good to go faster, to being an existential threat, because your competition are running away from you, and you can see them making products that are dramatically better than you and getting time to value that's dramatically lower. So I see what this really being driven by is a big goal to get better time to value out of what you can get out of developers. And underneath that, there's a whole lot of things like computers are now faster, developers are more expensive, but computers are also cheaper. So if you look at what it costs to get something done, it's much more of it is developer time, and the value of that time is more critical. Whereas what you're actually deploying on is getting quicker to deploy because of automation. and cloud and containers and things like serverless, or just speeding up the deployment from weeks to days to hours to milliseconds, basically. So we've got down to the point where you can get stuff deployed in trivially, but you still have to have an idea of what you want to do and have a culture that lets you do it, which is partly DevOps and partly Agile, different ways of thinking about that. And then how do you actually get that idea in front of somebody really quickly and find out whether it's a good idea in some way that doesn't break everything else? And that's the microservices and sort of A/B testing and feature flags all sort of tie in together. So there's a whole bunch of different pieces that tie together. But I think it all really rolls up to time to value is what we're optimizing for.
Absolutely. And I know there's we're both kind of fans of Simon Wardley, but the thing that I think is exciting is we're kind of coming to a new transition. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the S curves of commoditization that he often draws, but and you've also been around this game for a long time, going back to Sun and some of the transitions, value transitions that we've seen through the industry. I think that the new dominant paradigm is enabling this proliferation of lots of opportunities. And the people always say software is eating the world, and the framing I give here is it's not actually software. It's software is not a new thing. It's the fact that it's all connected. There's high-speed networks to basically the sum of all of human knowledge that's available in a supercomputer in pretty much everyone's pocket. So it's not just about software. It's connecting all this dynamics of that system and this information and the people, so that you're able to optimize for human performance and experience. But the capabilities, like going back to the time when Sun was the thing, if you're a startup and you wanted to test an idea, then you basically were looking at some sort of capital expense to get some servers, and it's going to be a long cycle before you even got to the point where you knew if your idea was valid, and that involved a lot more capital expense.
Yeah.
So the ability for a small team, even an individual right now, to spin up what in reality is a vast array of computing resources, that barrier to entry for what ideas can be tested, who can test them, at what speed, is just going down and down and down. Yeah,
there's been a long history here where, if you look back a few decades, then what we were really doing was in IT in most organizations was about managing manufacturing and employees. There was very little IT in most companies that was actually reaching out into the world and touching customers, because there wasn't a way to do that. And the thing that the internet changed was this ability to connect directly with people. And what you've seen in the last sort of, the last 10 years is companies finding that their critical thing they build is now their systems of engagement. Right? They aren't just making things in a factory, stuffing it in a box, and then hoping that somebody buys it, and you find out at the end of the quarter whether you made your numbers. The thing in the box is being tracked with an ID in the box on its way out to be shipped. When they open it out of the box and people buy it, there's a transaction that you know about. When you turn it on, it's connected. There's IoT kind of things. There's a mobile app. There's people tweeting about it. There's all the social media side. And then you're doing targeted advertising to people that are engaging with your product. All of those capabilities have now started to dominate the IT. And that, in that sense, it's the software eating the world of what companies are primarily doing to be competitive. Where if you go back 10, 20 years, if you had a better factory than somebody else, you could be competitive. And nowadays, you've got to have a better system of engagement with your customers to be competitive.
I think that brings up an interesting point. And let me see if you agree with this, that when you see the cloud natives, they view IT as a competitive advantage, where for many organizations, for, as you said, literally decades, those IT capabilities were always managed as a cost center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely moved from the cost center model. The cost center model is really back to, the sort of idea that you're managing the manufacturing and employees, right? That's where your costs are. And if you spend more money on that, you don't necessarily, unless you're in a service business where maybe you make your service reps a bit more efficient, it's hard to see the leverage into customers. But when the product is largely driven by the thing that people are interacting with, the mobile app is, if you look across all the different banks, they all have different mobile apps, and they're all, varying quality, and some are worse than others. And then you have, some people that are just diving in and just trying to make the best one they possibly can in the world, and they will get more customers because of that. That's the feedback loop that they're driving for, right? And that's something that, 10, 20 years ago, you weren't competitive as a bank because you could make a piece of software work on the thing in your pocket. That's a very different model to get to.
There wasn't things in people's pockets as part of the problem.
Yeah.
So on that, and Pivotal, as a consequence of kind of our focus, does a lot of work with banks. So what do you think that the banks need to think about, when they're managing these portfolios, when they're trying to move from whatever they do in IT today to whatever that future will look like? And I'm not sure how many conversations you have had with banks. I know you've had some, but,
quite a bit.
But like, how do you contrast the thought process, or their adoption with the startups, or what's available?
I've spent quite a bit of time with the whole area of finance, fintech, whatever. That whole area is right now adopting technology very rapidly, and they're trying to reinvent themselves. And there's a whole range of companies that are getting ahead of the pack, and there are others that are sort of getting dragged off of the sidelines and having to respond. So there's a whole different set of responses going on there. But some of the sort of horror stories are like, there's so much process that if you want a VM, you just want a machine to run something on, if you could get it in only a few months, you would be happy. More than 6 to 9 months has actually happened frequently. And there's like, well, how could it possibly take that time to file a ticket and have somebody click a button in vCenter, right? Well, that's not how long it's taking. It's massive levels of approvals and arguments and committees and being put at the bottom of a pile and waiting for budgets and stuff. But in the old days, you used to be going through that process to get, $1 million mainframe upgrade or something like that. And nowadays you're doing it to get, $20 worth of computing, right? If you look at, so I need a core and a gigabyte of RAM, what is that going to cost me per month? I mean, you're talking about a few $100s over a few years, rather than that used to cost an enormous amount. So to some extent, the processes that they've developed over the years and the compliance processes have just got totally out of whack with the cost of the thing that's flowing through that process, the resources that they're carefully controlling. I mean, this is sort of the way to think about it. If it takes you $5,000 of process time or $50,000 of process time to deploy $500 of compute resource, then you're crazy, right? You want it to be the other way around. You should have a process that costs less than the thing you're trying to deploy. Otherwise, you're just getting buried. And this is a lot of the why, this is the underlying sort of starting point from a lot of these people. They're trying to get to a point where they can do API-driven, on-demand, self-service deployments, but then they need a safe, compliant place to deploy to. And this is one of the areas where I see Cloud Foundry in particular coming up, because they can stand that up and say, this is a set of constraints that they can put policy around, and then they can have very rapid deploys into that. And they've sort of abstracted away from the fact that it took them 6 months to get that Cloud Foundry deployed, right? Because that was all the policy. But once it's deployed, then the application deployment is much faster once you're inside it.
I like to think of it as trying to make it so that the computers are the ones that are what enforces the policy, and that it makes doing the right thing the easy thing. So you have self-service access to the... I wonder how many of these organizations have actually done that financial analysis that you just mentioned, where they analyze what it's costing them with their process of approval relative to the resources being requested.
I mentioned it to a few people, and they've basically agreed with me as that, yeah, that sounds plausible. 10 to 100 times what the cost of the thing I asked for in human time, meetings, and general, process overhead. If you look at their budgets, they have huge budgets, and then a lot of that budget is going to waste. And this comes back to the other big bureaucracies of government, right, where we've seen what are relatively small, simple to deploy applications turning into billion-dollar sort of monsters that take forever and are terrible when they get deployed. And that goes back to, we mentioned Simon Wadley earlier. He was one of the authors of a British government paper called Better for Less. So that we can get the stuff done in a fraction of the time for a fraction of the money and have a much better outcome by just getting rapid iteration going and putting it in a framework, and not having the sort of have to decide your architecture and decide who you go out to contract every time you want to build something, where the time it takes to do that is longer than the thing you wanted to build in the first place. So again, it's this sense of appropriate capability. You want to have a PaaS where you can stand something up in a day or two that just does something for you. You're trying to solve the thing, and quite often you could have a day or two's worth of work take a year to get out because it's so wrapped in process, in sort of customized process. So I think a lot of the value, particularly in government, that I'm seeing is a lot of governments in particular have adopted Cloud Foundry because they're churning out relatively simple applications, and every city in the world needs an app that looks like that. Every country, every county, and then mostly the same everywhere in the world, right? They all have the same kind of like planning, approval process stuff. And it's being custom built over and over and over again. And what's happening now is they're building open source environments where they're all sharing them across countries. And I think that kind of thing is going to save enormous amounts of money and standardization. But they're not trying to build the next Snapchat or something. They're not trying to build a thing that looks different to capture the imagination of the teenagers and be the next big social thing. That's a very different kind of problem, right? They're
Absolutely.
trying to build something boring incredibly efficiently and cheaply, where the existing practices have got so overburdened that the system is ground to a halt pretty much.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, so many things. There's another aspect of this, and I think it's particularly in that enterprise segment where not only did they not have this sort of mindful understanding of what they were spending to deliver these things, but in many cases they're beholden to third parties to actually have any software capabilities at all.
Yep.
Certainly that's true in the. I'll kill that.
There's been a lot of outsourcing. Yeah, there was a whole wave of outsourcing because when IT was a cost center, you made it cheaper by outsourcing it, right? And we've seen some organizations that were very heavily outsourced. I think Capital One was in that state maybe 5-10 years ago, and then they decided to bring it back in-house. And they started to restaff, and they've taken control of their own IT, and they're driving, what they're doing in a very powerful way, and hiring a bunch of good people to do things. And now they started open sourcing things. You're seeing the sort of some of the leaders in this industry turn it right around from outsourcing back to driving it themselves. The UK government is another case of that, where again it was all outsourced, and they insourced to the individual departments to be able to just build stuff themselves.
I see that transition happening, but it goes a lot slower than I would like, and part of it just goes to just how much bureaucracy is involved. You literally have to change policy level decisions that were written in law in some cases to change some of those mechanics. So it's really interesting to watch that. And another thing that is interesting that's related to our friend Simon. And sort of the tension in some of the choices that people have in related to the exact same thing you just said about trying to standardize these things and use these tools that make doing the right thing the easy thing is optimizing for pioneers versus settlers, right? So in the example you just gave, where you have a fairly well-defined mission that is solved with a solution that you don't have to explore. Like the solution, you just want to get it out there and have the benefit of something that can help you deploy and manage it. and maybe there's some iteration, but you're not trying to, you used the example Snapchat, but whatever, build the future of some kind of crazy audacious goal. You just need that settler mentality. It's like, hey, here's a bunch of these solutions that we don't need to build ourselves. They've already been put together in a thoughtful way that will solve the exact problem we have. So let's just use them.
Yeah, by the time people our age have heard of something like Snapchat, it's already old hat, and the kids have moved on to something else. So we actually have no idea what the latest hot thing is, and by the time we do realize it, it's no longer the hot thing, right? There's definitely a market for generations to pick up on something new, and there's people trying to capture that. And sort of, if you look at Netflix, where I spent 7 years of sort of trying to build things and as the cloud architect there, we were trying to rebuild the entertainment industry, trying to innovate, trying to out-innovate on a number of different fronts. Picture quality, the streaming ability to stream without having rebuffers. These are things that you're making go away, right? You should just be watching TV and enjoying the show, and you shouldn't be thinking this is on Netflix while it's playing. At the end, you realize, oh yeah, I was watching that on Netflix. So getting that kind of immersive quality, there's a huge amount of innovation going on there, though it's not visible in the user interface, other than it's almost like the absence of a user interface is the value. And then the other side, the discovery side and the personalization, just trying to be on the absolute bleeding edge of everything that they could do. And so that was a pioneering culture. And what we did by getting into AWS early was, again, pioneering at the infrastructure level to build out all of the things we needed to do that. And then, again, sort of influenced to some extent by Simon, again, sort of using open source as a weapon, as a competitive edge in the market. And in this case, it's the market for mostly for who you can hire, the kind of developers that want to work somewhere like Netflix. You attract a lot of people by having a strong open source program. So that was the primary reason that we open sourced all of this stuff in the first place. And then to get a platform built around it, we were validating the architecture made sense, figuring out which bits everyone piled into and said, yeah, we need that. And then which bits just got totally ignored. We should probably not have built that in the first place. What is everyone else doing? Okay, there's another way of doing it that everyone else has piled into. So it was, to some extent, architectural validation. And ending up, the third main reason for the open source was to have fast followers. People using AWS in particular in volume, the way we did. And the easiest way was to give people the same code, so AWS would just see the same type of API calls in the same sequences. And that way, you can try and avoid being the biggest fish in a small pond. You don't want to be a shark in a paddling pool. Some of my favorite images of this. You want to be a tiny fish in a huge pond, and you get the pond to be bigger by inviting everybody else to join in, and then the pond grows because everyone's there. So those were the primary reasons for the Netflix open source program. And on top of that, there's some technology branding, which sort of overflows a bit. So people generally see Netflix as a technology leading brand, and that's makes more difference. I'm not sure that bleeds over that much into people watching TV really care about that, but it certainly helped on the sort of recruiting and sort of thought leadership side for continuing to get the architectural ideas discussed.
So this brings up an interesting phenomena, and I have lots of conversations where people talk about not being able to find the talent that they need to work on their projects. And like I said before, I never worked at Netflix, but I know a bunch of those people, and I've worked in teams where I felt like we had a mission. And I imagine, at the point where Netflix is building this thing that is taking 1/3 of the internet traffic in the peak time, that the people building that have this like strong sense of accomplishment and team. Like the talent attracts the talent because it has a mission, right? So you have talent that's not only talented. Well, go ahead.
It's got purpose-driven culture, is what it's usually called.
Purpose-driven culture.
Yeah, so here's a clear purpose. And one of the things about Netflix, and if you think, it's maybe not obvious until you say it, but it's a single product company very deliberately, right? It's just really doing, primarily video streaming. It was a single purpose company doing DVD shipping, and now it's flipped over to be video streaming. And it doesn't want to dilute that by having other things it does too. So there's lots of other adjacent things that they could have done. But what they do is they confuse the product. It makes the purpose more diluted and more fractional. So most companies end up having a whole pile of products that they're trying to get out. And what's the purpose of the company? Well, we've got 10 purposes. Well, we've got 10 groups that are actually optimizing for different things. And it's quite hard to do that. So having a singularity of purpose is a interesting sort of cultural characteristic that Netflix is very focused on. And it also ties into that Netflix has never actually acquired a company. And Reed was asked about this recently. He says, no reason to acquire a company. They only have one purpose. They can hire people from other companies, but they don't want to acquire an entire company, right? And so most companies grow through acquisition, and there's a whole bunch of different strategies. And I was talking to somebody I know who's a finance guy whose job in finance is to acquire companies, and was just baffled at the thought that we would never do that, right? It's so much a part of corporate culture is you have a M&A department, right? Because that's what you do, right? So
that's a very I don't know how you would describe it, but it's like deliberately using focus as a weapon to help drive things.
Incredibly focused. So very singular purpose, very focused, and with that, everyone knows what you've got to do, and everyone is basically betting on the survival of that purpose. So it's kind of, Scott McNeely quote was all the wood behind one arrowhead. Back when he was trying to get Sun to focus on things, right? So it's getting that focus is one of the things that makes Netflix very successful, and able to you hire people and understand what they can do. You were talking a bit earlier though about how hard it is to find good people, and there's a couple of one anecdote I've told many times, which is that I was talking to a bunch of executives at a CIO summit. And they were saying, well, it's really hard to find these people. All this Netflix stuff is great, but we can't find these people. And I look around the nameplates and say, well, we hired them from you, right? They weren't formed fully. We don't have a little vat that spits out little Netflix employees like from a cloning machine. They all were experienced people, and they all worked at big companies. And so if you look around, these companies probably still have people who are maybe as good as the people that did decide to leave and join Netflix. But so what's the difference? And the difference is they've got a culture that systematically gets in the way of innovation, minimizes people, stifles their ability to get things done, and tends to peanut butter people to the same level. So it's hard to get differential rewards and attention to the really good people, because the system is set up that, with political favoritism and senses of fairness and all these different things, that it's actually quite difficult sometimes for the people that are really good to get the most out of them. So that's a cultural challenge that anyone can take on, but it's not a hiring challenge. It's much more of a unlocking the talent you've already got. And so my contention is that most people have vastly more talent in their organization than they actually understand, and that they could get vastly more out of it. But it's a difficult cultural transition to actually do that. And you have to find a way to get these people, the people that are going to leave, and make them be people that can lead the change.
So I think we see the same things. We definitely agree that this is, well, I think very explicitly that it's not just about technology. This is like a socio-technical system where it's the people and the technology interacting that gives you the results. So I'm not sure I always have a great kind of, here, take this red pill and it'll fix your culture. But what kind of advice do you have to these organizations that are already, for whatever reason, they have lots of products, they have lots of developers, and they're trying to find that purpose, or they're trying to find those kind of unifying things that allow that talent density to emerge and bring all the capabilities that they desperately want. What kind of advice are you giving to people, or how do you see approaching that problem?
Now, if there was a pill for culture, then we'd be it must be much easier. So think of culture as the shared understanding of a group of people, right? You've got shared values, understandings, and a shared understanding of what that culture is. It's very easy to fracture culture. Like if you acquire a company, you've just fractured your culture and you have to figure out how to absorb them into your culture or merge it or blend it. It's difficult. This is one of the reasons that Netflix doesn't like acquiring companies, because it's trying to build a very purposeful culture. So the first thing is, if you're a tiny company just starting out, is to be really purposeful about the culture you want, right? Don't just let it happen to you. And a lot of people get a little bit too big before they start worrying about what is the culture they want. And then they're sort of half stuck with what they've got. So part of it is to be intentional. Now, if you're a big company, it's really incredibly difficult. And it's, if you're stuck in a big company, you hate the culture, the best thing to do is leave and find a company with a culture that fits you. Then what you can do, though, and what I'm seeing happen in large organizations is, and this is all tied into the whole kind of cloud DevOps, microservices kind of thing, is they're forming small cellular organizations where each cell has effectively owns its own product, can develop it, operates it, is on call when it breaks, and is effectively building a web service that the rest of the company uses as if it was another company coming from some other company. So between these cells or these small microservice based groups, you've got low trust. So you can sort of use your existing compliance, low trust bureaucracy stuff. But what you're doing is you're organizing a series of high trust cells, which are able to run at really high speed, and you're composing stuff at low trust levels across them. Now you still have to have some stability across those boundaries, stability across those APIs. But it's kind of like saying, I'm going to use Google Maps API, and I'm assuming Google Maps is not about to disappear on me, because, I don't have a contract with Google that tells me it's going to disappear or not disappear. I assume it's not going to go away. And yeah, maybe every now and again something does disappear and you have to flip to a different API. But generally speaking, you can evolve your system much more quickly if you've got these little groups going very fast behind, sort of within these boundaries. You see what I mean?
So I think so. So you're basically in a sense refactoring the monolithic organization into these microservice teams, just like you would refactor a monolithic application.
You're taking the sort of stovepipe, silo, whatever you want to call it, model, which is designed to be very efficient, and which is efficient in a case where technology is expensive, but it's slow because you have to coordinate across all your silos. And you're saying, what really matters is being fast, and we're going to trade some efficiency for speed. So it turns out the cost of the inefficiency of having to coordinate across silos is actually most of the cost. And if you take all of that coordinating out, it turns out you can get stuff done incredibly quickly underneath. So you're able to build teams that are cross-cutting. So this is also sometimes a move from project to product-based organizations is another way people talk about it. You're forming these small teams. They own everything they need to evolve. And maybe some of these teams are building brand new products, inventing things. And then sometimes it matures out to being a relatively, slowly changing, keep the lights on and add patches to it. And you can still hand that over to a team that can maybe pick that up. So sometimes there's handovers between teams, but there's a sense of ownership. And you don't try and spread these teams around the world. It's like if you've got teams spread around the world, maybe you've got some low-cost team somewhere in Asia who you've hired because they're cheap. Well, you give them the maintenance jobs, but they own an entire evolution of a service. They don't just do QA on it. They own the entire service and its API. And you have some other team of hotshots who are like the best people you can find, building the brand new services, and then maybe passing them on through some sort of chaining it off into different groups. But while they own it, they evolve it and they run it. And that kind of model, I think, is the cultural change that I'm actually seeing happen in a lot of large enterprises and in governments and areas like that.
Yeah, you're either going to deliberately manipulate Conway's law or you're going to be a victim of it. Yeah,
so this is, it's called the reverse Conway maneuver by some people. Like you're using Conway's law to basically set the structure. And if you fight against Conway's law, you will always end up, getting into trouble.
It's not just a good idea; it's the law.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you can work against it, but why would you want to be running into a headwind when you can have it at your back, right?
Use gravity.
It's just going to make it much easier.
Use gravity in your favor.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good stopping point. I always learn things. I think you're insightful and thoughtful about the way that you put things together, and you have such a unique perspective on what you've been able to see and accomplish. So we're looking forward to seeing you in Vegas. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, it's been fun to chat. I think it's been a great time. I think my final thought is really that it's much more fun to be working in a small team when you have ownership of something. So it isn't just a better way of working. It's actually more fun and more productive, and it's easier to hire and retain people. So if developers can get more done and have a better time doing things, then this is the new world, and we should be optimizing for that, because the developers that don't get that experience will be voting with their feet and leaving and going somewhere else where they can actually have more fun producing things more productively and see the things they've produced actually running in production, making a difference to other people. And that's kind of the feedback loop that people like to see.
When you're doing it right, everybody wins.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, again, it's been a pleasure, and I'll see you in about a month in Las Vegas. Thanks, Adrian.
Right, cheers. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.